May 19, 1945. The desert sun blazed mercilessly over Camp Florence, Arizona, where 250 Japanese prisoners of war lined up in formation outside the mess hall, their faces weathered by months of captivity in the American Southwest. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, formerly of the Imperial Army's 16th Division, stood among them, his uniform faded but pressed, wondering what new work detail awaited them in the cotton fields, or perhaps the neighboring farms where they had labored since their capture in the Pacific campaigns. Like every man in that formation, Tanaka believed he understood exactly what the rest of his captivity would bring: monotonous labor, adequate food, and the slow passage of time until the conflict ended and they could return home to whatever remained of their defeated nation. They could not have been more wrong about what was about to happen. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these men were about to experience would shatter every assumption they held about their captors, their own propaganda, and the very nature of the land they had been taught to conquer. Over the next 72 hours, these prisoners would undergo a transformation so profound that decades later, survivors would describe it as the moment they truly understood they had lost not just a conflict, but had been fighting on the wrong side of history itself. Major Robert Henderson of the United States Army stood before the assembled prisoners, flanked by 2 interpreters. At 43 years old, Henderson had spent most of the conflict managing POW facilities across the American Southwest, overseeing 13 camps that held nearly 50,000 prisoners from various theaters of operation. He had studied the Geneva Conventions extensively and believed firmly in their principles, even when his own brother had perished at Pearl Harbor 4 years earlier. "Gentlemen," Henderson began, his voice carrying across the dusty parade ground as Sergeant Kenji Yoshida translated into Japanese, "You are about to participate in what we call a morale excursion. Over the next 3 days, you will travel by bus to see one of America's natural wonders. This is not a trick. This is not propaganda. This is simply something we believe you should see." The prisoners exchanged confused glances. Tanaka leaned slightly toward Private First Class Akira Yamamoto, who stood beside him. "This must be some kind of psychological operation," Tanaka whispered. "They want us to see American cities, to break our spirit with displays of their industrial might." Yamamoto nodded slowly, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. At 24 years old, he was among the youngest in the formation, captured on Saipan after his entire unit had been overrun by overwhelming American firepower. "Perhaps, Lieutenant, but why tell us in advance? Why not simply transport us?" The question went unanswered as Henderson continued with the logistics. They would depart at dawn, traveling in 4 buses with armed guards. They would be fed 3 meals daily. They would sleep in designated camping areas. And they would be treated, Henderson emphasized, with the dignity owed to soldiers who had fought honorably, regardless of the conflict's outcome. That night, the barracks hummed with speculation. Corporal Takeshi Sato, a former schoolteacher from Osaka who had been conscripted in 1942, sat on his bunk writing in the diary he had maintained throughout his captivity. His hands, calloused from farm work, but still capable of elegant brushstrokes, moved carefully across the page. "Tomorrow we embark on a journey that makes no sense," he wrote by candlelight. "The Americans feed us adequately when their own citizens face rationing. They provide medical care superior to what we received in our own army. They pay us small wages for our labor and allow us to purchase amenities from the camp store. And now they wish to show us their land. Captain Watanabe says this is because they want us to feel small, to recognize the impossibility of Japan ever matching American resources. Perhaps he is right. Or perhaps there is something else at work here, something I do not yet understand." At 05:30 hours the next morning, the buses departed Camp Florence in a convoy that stretched nearly a quarter mile. Each bus carried approximately 60 men, guards stationed at front and rear, weapons visible but not threatening. The prisoners settled into their seats with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, watching through windows as the Arizona landscape rolled past. Tanaka found himself seated next to Staff Sergeant Ichiro Nakamura, a veteran of the China campaign, who had been captured in the Marshall Islands. Nakamura had fought for nearly 7 years, from the Marco Polo Bridge incident through multiple campaigns across Asia and the Pacific. His weathered face bore the marks of someone who had seen too much, endured too much, lost too much. "In China, we marched prisoners for days without food," Nakamura said quietly, staring out the window at the passing desert. "When they fell, we left them. When they begged for water, we ignored them. And when they reached the camps, those who survived found only more cruelty." He paused, his jaw tightening. "These Americans, they treat us better than we treated our own men. I do not understand it." The convoy drove north through the Sonoran Desert, the landscape gradually transforming from saguaro cacti and creosote bushes to higher elevation terrain. They stopped for lunch at a designated rest area where American soldiers distributed box lunches containing sandwiches, fruit, cookies, and canteens of cold water. The prisoners ate in silence, many still expecting some revelation of the trip's true purpose. Private Yamamoto opened his sandwich and stared at it. Thick slices of bread, generous portions of meat and cheese, crisp lettuce. "My family had not eaten this well in 2 years before I was conscripted," he murmured to Tanaka. "They told us Americans were starving, that their economy had collapsed, that they could barely feed their own soldiers." "Propaganda," Tanaka replied, though saying the word aloud felt like admitting a personal failure. He had believed those reports. He had repeated them to his own men. He had shaped his understanding of the conflict around the certainty that Japan fought a desperate but declining enemy. Every piece of evidence since his capture had contradicted that certainty, yet some part of him had clung to it anyway, unable to fully process the implications of being so comprehensively wrong. As the convoy climbed higher into the Mogollon Rim country, the temperature dropped, and ponderosa pines began appearing among the vegetation. Many of the prisoners had never seen such trees, having come from tropical or temperate regions of Japan and spending their military service in Pacific islands. Corporal Sato pressed his face against the window, watching the forest thicken around them. "It reminds me of the mountains near Nagano," he said to the man beside him, "but bigger. Everything here is bigger." They reached the first camping area as evening approached, a designated site with latrines, water facilities, and cleared areas for tents. The American guards distributed camping equipment and established a perimeter, but the atmosphere remained oddly relaxed. Henderson walked among the prisoners as they set up their temporary shelters, accompanied by interpreter Yoshida. "Tomorrow morning, we will reach our destination," Henderson announced. "I know many of you are confused about the purpose of this journey. Some of you probably believe this is psychological warfare. Others may think it is simply arbitrary cruelty, a way to exhaust you with pointless travel." He paused, looking across the faces illuminated by the setting sun. "The truth is simpler, and I hope better. We want you to see something beautiful. We want you to understand that the world is larger and more magnificent than any conflict, any nation, any ideology. We want you to remember when this is all over that there is something worth preserving." After Henderson departed, the prisoners gathered in small groups around their tents. Captain Masao Watanabe, the senior Japanese officer present, called together his subordinates. "This is certainly psychological warfare," Watanabe stated firmly. The captain had been captured in the Philippines and carried himself with the rigid bearing of a career officer. "They wish to overwhelm us with the grandeur of America, to make us feel that resistance was futile from the beginning. It is designed to break our spirit, to make us doubt the righteousness of our cause." But Nakamura, the old China veteran, shook his head slowly. "With respect, Captain, I no longer know what our cause was. I thought we fought to liberate Asia from Western imperialism. But we brought only death and suffering to the Chinese, to the Filipinos, to the people of every land we entered. The Americans, they could treat us as we treated others. But they do not. Why? What does that mean about who we were and what we did?" The question hung in the air, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Watanabe's face reddened, but he said nothing. Around them other prisoners listened in silence, each grappling with similar thoughts that could not be spoken aloud in the barracks, but emerged here under foreign stars, far from everything they had known. Tanaka lay in his tent that night, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. Through the canvas, he could hear the sounds of the American guards changing shifts, their voices casual and relaxed, discussing baseball games and girlfriends back home. They did not sound like conquerors. They did not sound like the demons Japanese propaganda had portrayed. They sounded like men who wanted to finish their duty and return to normal lives. He thought about his own conduct during the conflict. He had followed orders. He had led his men according to regulations. He had sincerely believed, that Japan fought a defensive struggle against encirclement and strangulation by Western powers. But every day of captivity had revealed new evidence contradicting that narrative. The abundance of American resources, the casual technological superiority, the sheer productive capacity that could feed and clothe and equip millions of soldiers, while civilians maintained living standards that exceeded wartime Japan's best years. Dawn came cold and clear. The prisoners broke camp efficiently, their military training evident in how quickly they organized and prepared for departure. By 7 o'clock, the convoy was moving again, climbing through pine forests that grew increasingly dense as they gained elevation. Around mid-morning, the buses began to slow. They had reached an area where the forest opened into scenic overlooks, and Henderson ordered the convoy to stop at one such viewpoint. The prisoners disembarked, stretching their legs and looking out over the landscape. "This is just the approach," one of the American guards said to interpreter Yoshida. "Wait until they see the real thing." The buses continued, winding along roads that seemed to approach some invisible destination. Then, without warning, the forest ended, and the earth simply disappeared. The Grand Canyon opened before them like a wound in the world itself, a chasm so vast and incomprehensible that several prisoners actually stumbled backward in shock. The buses pulled into the parking area at Mather Point, and as the men disembarked, a collective gasp rippled through the formation. Tanaka stood frozen, his mind unable to process the scale of what he was seeing. The canyon stretched before him in layer upon layer of ancient rock, each stratum a different color, rust red, bone white, purple gray, ochre yellow, descending nearly a mile into depths where a silver thread of river wound between vertical walls. The far rim seemed impossibly distant, though it was less than 10 miles away, a straight line across a void that contained mountains and valleys, and geological time made visible. "It is not real," Yamamoto whispered beside him. "It cannot be real. Nothing can be this large." Corporal Sato had dropped to his knees, tears streaming down his face. Around him, other men wept openly, overwhelmed by the beauty and magnitude of what they were witnessing. Some sat down heavily as if their legs could no longer support them. Others simply stood, mouths open, unable to form words. Nakamura walked slowly toward the rim, accompanied by an American guard who made no attempt to restrain him. The old soldier stood at the edge, looking down into the abyss and then out across the vast expanse. His shoulders began to shake, and he covered his face with his hands. "All those years," he said in Japanese, his voice breaking, "all that death, all that suffering, and the world contained this all along. While we fought over tiny islands, this existed. While we struggled for meters of jungle or coral, this was here, untouched, eternal, indifferent to our madness." Henderson stood nearby, watching the prisoners' reactions with satisfaction. He had made this trip with 7 previous groups, and the response was always the same: shock, awe, tears, and then a profound silence, as men grappled with something larger than anything they had experienced in the conflict. "Why did you bring us here?" Tanaka asked, approaching the major with Yoshida translating. "What is the purpose of this?" Henderson considered the question carefully before answering. "My country is not perfect, Lieutenant. We have made terrible mistakes. We will make more. But we believe some things transcend nations and conflicts. Beauty is one of those things. Truth is another. And the truth is that the world is filled with marvels that belong to all humanity, not to any single people or ideology." He gestured toward the canyon. "This formed over millions of years. Civilizations rose and fell, empires conquered and crumbled, and this simply continued becoming what it is. It will outlast America, just as it outlasted every society that came before. It reminds us of our proper scale in the universe." Throughout the day, the prisoners explored the rim, walking along designated trails, sitting at various viewpoints, simply absorbing the reality of what they were experiencing. The American guards maintained a loose perimeter, but interfered with nothing, allowing the men to process this in their own ways. Private Yamamoto sat on a rock outcropping, dangling his legs over the void. An American soldier seated nearby, ensuring his safety. "I was prepared to die for the Emperor," Yamamoto said in halting English he had been learning in the camp. "I believe Japan fought for divine purpose, that our cause was sacred." The American soldier, a young corporal from Kansas named William Matthews, nodded slowly. "My brother believed he fought for freedom and democracy. He was lost at Guadalcanal. I think maybe all of us believe something, but what does this believe?" He gestured at the canyon. "It does not care about our flags or our causes. It just is." The conversation was clumsy, limited by language barriers and the vast gulf of experience that separated them. But something essential was communicated anyway, something that transcended words. Two young men who might have faced each other across a battlefield, sitting together in the presence of something that rendered their conflict small and temporary and ultimately meaningless, compared to the deep time and vast beauty of the natural world. Captain Watanabe stood apart from the others, his face rigid with an emotion that might have been anger or grief or simply overwhelming confusion. Tanaka approached him carefully. "Captain, are you well?" Watanabe did not look at him. "I have served the Emperor for 20 years. I have studied Bushido since childhood. I believed, Lieutenant. I believed in our divine mission, in our racial superiority, in our destiny to rule Asia. And now they show us this." His voice cracked slightly. "They could have kept us in camps, worked us like animals, starved us, humiliated us. Instead, they brought us here. Why, to prove their superiority? To mock our defeat? Or because they actually believe what that American major said, that some things transcend our conflict? I do not know, Captain. Neither do I. And that terrifies me more than any battle I have fought." As sunset approached, Henderson gathered the prisoners at the main viewing area. The light transformed the canyon into something almost supernatural. Shadows deepening to purple-black, while the upper layers blazed orange and red and gold. The Colorado River, invisible for most of the day, caught the light and gleamed like molten copper far below. "We will camp here tonight," Henderson announced. "Tomorrow you will have most of the day to explore before we begin the return journey. Use this time however you wish. Reflect, rest, or simply look. This place asks nothing of you except that you see it." That night, the prisoners camped along the rim, forbidden fires preventing them from building blazes, but the clear sky providing starlight so brilliant that shadows moved across the ground. Corporal Sato sat with his diary, struggling to find words adequate to what he had experienced. "How do I describe this?" he wrote. "What words exist in any language to capture what I have seen today? I thought I understood scale from the ocean, from mountains, from the sky itself. But this is different. This is the earth opened up, showing its bones, its history written in stone. Each layer is millions of years. Humanity is less than a footnote. Japan, America, this entire conflict. We are nothing. We are dust. And yet, in our nothingness, we created so much suffering, so much death, all because we believed our tiny moment mattered more than anything else." Around him, other prisoners conducted similar conversations, though most did so silently, inside their own thoughts. The usual camp chatter was absent. Men sat alone or in small groups, staring into the darkness of the canyon, each processing what this meant for their understanding of themselves, their nation, their cause. Nakamura found Tanaka sitting at the rim's edge, his feet dangling over the void. "May I join you, Lieutenant?" "Of course." They sat in silence for several minutes before Nakamura spoke. "I thought I had seen everything the conflict could show me. I saw cities in China burning for days. I saw battleships exploding. I saw men die in every way humans can die. But this," he gestured at the canyon, barely visible in starlight, "this has affected me more deeply than any of that loss." "Because it shows us what we could have been doing," Tanaka replied quietly. "Instead of conquering, we could have been creating and discovering. Instead of spreading suffering, we could have been seeking beauty." We could have spent our lives building things that mattered, making things that lasted, finding places like this and simply appreciating them. It is too late for us, Lieutenant. We are what the conflict made us. But perhaps if we survive to return home, we can tell others. We can say that we saw something larger than empire, more permanent than victory, more meaningful than glory. The next morning brought clouds that intermittently obscured the canyon, creating a constantly changing display as sunlight broke through in shafts that illuminated different sections while leaving others in shadow. The prisoners spent the day exploring the various viewpoints, walking trails that led along the rim, and simply sitting in contemplation. Private Yamamoto encountered Major Henderson at one overlook, the American officer standing alone, smoking a cigarette and watching the play of light across the rock walls. "Major, may I ask question?" Yamamoto said in his careful English. "Of course." "Why you do this? Bring enemy soldiers to see beautiful place. We fought against America. We brought down your ships. Why you show us this kindness?" Henderson took a long drag on his cigarette before answering. "My brother was at Pearl Harbor. He was a mechanic on the Arizona. When the ship exploded, they never found his body. For a long time, I hated every Japanese soldier, every Japanese person. I wanted justice." He paused, flicking ash over the rim. "But then I started running POW camps, and I met men like you, like Lieutenant Tanaka, like Sergeant Nakamura. Men who were soldiers because their country demanded it, who fought because they believed their leaders, who did terrible things because they were ordered to and thought it was right. Just like my brother, who would have done the same if ordered, because that was his duty. I realized we are all just men, caught in something bigger than ourselves. And if there is any hope for the future, any chance that our children will not repeat our mistakes, it begins with recognizing our common humanity. This canyon," he gestured at the vast expanse, "it reminds us of that. It shows us that we are all temporary, all small, all part of something much larger than our nations or our conflicts." Yamamoto was quiet for a long moment. "I understand," he finally said. "Thank you, Major. For brother, I am sorry, and for showing us this, I am grateful." As the day progressed, something shifted in the prisoner's demeanor. The initial shock and awe gave way to something deeper, acceptance perhaps, or a kind of peace. Men who had been rigid with military bearing relaxed. Those who had maintained emotional distance from their captors began engaging in genuine conversation with the American guards. Captain Watanabe approached Henderson in the afternoon. Through interpreter Yoshida, he said, "Major, I wish to thank you for bringing us here. I do not fully understand your motivations, and I suspect I will spend many years trying to process what I have seen. But I recognize that you have given us a gift. You did not have to do this. The Geneva Conventions do not require you to show us beauty or help us understand the world differently. You did this because you believed it was right. That means something. That means more than you may know." Henderson nodded gravely. "Captain, this conflict will end soon. When it does, you and your men will go home to a Japan that must rebuild, not just its cities, but its understanding of itself and its place in the world. I hope this experience, small as it is, will be part of that rebuilding. I hope you will remember that the world is large enough for all of us, beautiful enough to be worth preserving and precious enough that no ideology justifies harming it." On the final morning, as the prisoners prepared to board the buses for the return journey, Corporal Sato made a final entry in his diary. His handwriting was careful and precise, each character formed with deliberate attention. "We leave this place today, but I know I will never truly leave. What I have seen here will remain with me always. When I return to Japan, if I survive, I will tell everyone about this canyon, not as a symbol of American power, though it is certainly that, not as proof of our defeat, though it serves that purpose as well, but as evidence that the world contains wonders we cannot imagine, beauties we cannot comprehend, and scales of time that render our conflicts meaningless." The convoy departed the Grand Canyon at 9 o'clock in the morning. The buses filled with quiet, contemplative men who stared out windows at the receding pine forests. They camped that night at the same location as their outbound journey, and the atmosphere remained subdued, reflective. The convoy reached Camp Florence late on the third day. The familiar barracks and fences, somehow looking different to men who had seen something that existed beyond any human construction. The prisoners disembarked quietly, formed ranks, and were dismissed to their quarters. That night, the barracks hummed with conversation, unlike any that had occurred during their captivity. Men who had maintained strict military hierarchy ignored rank to share their thoughts and feelings. Those who had held on to rigid beliefs found them loosened, made flexible by exposure to something their ideology could not explain or contain. In the weeks that followed, something changed in Camp Florence. The prisoners remained prisoners. The conflict remained unfinished. The uncertainty about the future remained absolute. But the men who had visited the Grand Canyon carried themselves differently. They worked their assigned tasks with the same diligence, but without the underlying resentment. They interacted with guards as individuals, rather than representatives of the enemy. They began, tentatively at first, and then more openly, to question the narratives they had believed about America, about the conflict, about their own nation's conduct. Major Henderson observed these changes with quiet satisfaction. He had overseen 13 such trips, transporting over 2,000 prisoners to witness the canyon. Each group had reacted similarly, though individual responses varied. Some men remained rigid in their beliefs, unable or unwilling to process what they had seen. Others experienced profound transformations, their entire worldview shifting in response to beauty and scale they could not deny or rationalize away. "You think it makes a difference?" his adjutant asked one evening as they reviewed camp reports. "I know it makes a difference," Henderson replied. "Every man who returns to Japan carrying the memory of that canyon is a seed of change. Some seeds will not germinate. Some will be crushed by the trauma and devastation they find at home. But some will grow. Some will tell their children and grandchildren about the day they stood at the edge of something magnificent and realized the world was larger than their nation, more beautiful than their ideology, and worth preserving beyond any empire's ambitions." The conflict ended 4 months later with Japan's surrender. Sergeant Nakamura learned that his family had perished in earlier events, and he returned to Japan in early 1946, devastated by his loss but carrying the determination to honor their memory by teaching peace. Lieutenant Tanaka returned to find his hometown of Yokohama largely damaged, his family surviving but living in rubble. He became a translator, helping American occupation forces communicate with Japanese civilians, a choice that brought him ostracism from some, but which he pursued because he believed understanding between peoples was the only path to lasting peace. Corporal Sato returned to Osaka, where he resumed his teaching career. For the next 40 years until his retirement in 1985, he told every class about the Grand Canyon. He showed them his diary entries from that journey. He described the vastness, the beauty, the profound impact of witnessing something so magnificent. And he told them that the world contained wonders worth preserving, that no conflict justified harming such beauty, that humanity's highest calling was not conquest, but creation. Private Yamamoto did correspond with Corporal Matthews. Their letters, awkward at first, gradually became more comfortable. In 1962, Yamamoto visited America with his wife and son, and Matthews met them at the Grand Canyon. The two former enemies stood together, where they had first truly seen each other as human beings, now older, now friends, their sons playing together at the rim, while their fathers remembered a different time. Captain Watanabe struggled more than most. The rigid certainty that had sustained him through 2 decades of military service had been shattered, and he never fully recovered his equilibrium. He became a recluse after returning to Japan, unable to reconcile his actions during the conflict with what he had learned about himself and his nation. But before his death in 1957, he left a letter to be opened after his passing. In it, he described his visit to the Grand Canyon and concluded, "I wish I had seen this before the conflict began. Perhaps if our leaders had witnessed such beauty, had understood our true scale in the universe, they would not have led us into such catastrophic delusion. Beauty is not weakness. Humility is not defeat. And recognizing something greater than ourselves is not surrender but wisdom." The story of Japanese prisoners visiting the Grand Canyon remained largely unknown for decades. It was not the kind of narrative that fit neatly into either nation's mythology. Americans preferred stories of decisive victory. Japanese preferred stories of noble suffering and eventual recovery. A tale of enemy soldiers being shown beauty as an act of compassionate education fit neither framework. But the men who made that journey never forgot. They told their families, their friends, anyone who would listen. They spoke of standing at the rim of an ancient canyon and understanding, perhaps for the first time, that they were part of something much larger than their nation or their conflict. They described how it felt to have their certainty shattered, their propaganda revealed, their worldview fundamentally altered by exposure to undeniable magnificence. In 1988, surviving members of those Grand Canyon excursions organized a reunion at the site. 43 former prisoners made the journey, now elderly men accompanied by children and grandchildren. Major Henderson, then 91 years old, attended as well, traveling from his retirement home in Virginia to meet once more the men whose lives he had hoped to touch all those years ago. They gathered at Mather Point, the same overlook where many of them had first seen the canyon. They stood together, former enemies, now simply old men sharing a memory of a moment when they had glimpsed something eternal. Some wept, others laughed. All of them looked out across that vast expanse and remembered being young and frightened and confused, standing at the edge of everything they had known and seeing, finally, what truly mattered. Nakamura, now 72 years old and a respected educator who had taught 3 generations of students, spoke to the assembled group. "We came here as prisoners," he said in English he had perfected over decades of teaching. "We came carrying hate and confusion and the weight of terrible things we had done and had done to us. Major Henderson brought us here not to mock our defeat or prove American superiority, but to show us that the world contained beauty worth preserving, truth worth seeking, and common humanity worth recognizing." He paused, looking at Henderson, who sat in a wheelchair at the rim. "Sir, you could not have known how much that simple act would mean. You could not have predicted that every man here would carry this memory with them always, would use it to guide their choices, would tell their children about the day they learned that beauty transcends conflict and humanity transcends nations. But that is what happened. You planted seeds that grew in ways you could not imagine. Thank you." The reunion lasted 3 days, mirroring the original journey. The elderly former prisoners explored the trails they had walked decades before, showed their families the viewpoints where they had experienced their transformations, and shared stories late into the night about how that single experience had shaped the rest of their lives. Major Henderson passed away 6 months after the reunion. At his funeral, attended by family and former colleagues, a letter was read from the Japanese survivors of the Grand Canyon trips. It thanked him for his service, not as a military officer, but as an educator, a humanitarian, and ultimately a peacemaker. It acknowledged that his actions had helped shape a generation of Japanese citizens who returned from captivity committed to peace, understanding, and international cooperation. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.